we can pontificate as much as we like about the budget. We can share as much rhetoric as we care to share. In fact, national MPs have done plenty of that. We've heard a lot of talking in the abstract. I don't know how many times I've heard the word aspiration. I'm still none the wiser as to how they actually believe that this budget creates any aspiration. We've had a lot of talk about hip pockets. And sometimes we've even heard contradictory slogans coming from the national MPs, including, for instance, the fact that this government is oh so fiscally prudent, whilst at the same time we're seeing the country being moved into an extra $1 billion of debt in order to fund these tax cuts. And that's before I even take into account the additional cuts that have come to health and education to fund them. But I can understand that perhaps that's just a little contradiction of messaging. What I cannot abide is the utter hypocrisy to claim that in any way this... I'll take that on.
Point of order. Tim McIndoe.
The member knows she cannot use that word in this House, and it's very rich coming from her.
Well, he just ruined his order.
Yes, you don't need to comment further. The member knows you can't use that word. Jacinda Ardern.
What I cannot abide are any slogans or statements claiming that this is a budget for the future of New Zealand, when in the same breath we have seen from the last budget the continuing and ongoing suspension of contributions to the superannuation fund, which does nothing to assist the next generation to pay for the baby boomers now in the super that we will need to provide for them if we are to continue the accord of supporting the old in retirement. Add on top of that the fact that the future generations will be subsidising heavy polluters through that government's ETS scheme, which does nothing to encourage or incentivise a reduction in emissions. And finally, I could also add to that list the fact that HCC is being whittled away, a scheme that those members all benefited in their youth and in their heyday, which young people will not have, if they ever had one indeed, which young people will not have the benefit of. So I cannot let that assumption stand that this government has done anything for the future generations of New Zealand. But I do want to apply a different measure to the budget, and this is not one of slogans, statements or calculators, but simply the message that I'm receiving out and about in Auckland Central in particular about people's individual experiences of what this budget will mean for them, putting aside all the hypothetical talk of hip pockets and looking at what it will in practice mean for some of those families. And I think probably the first I would choose to raise is the simple measure of the cost of living, because that is what's raised with me most often when I'm talking to families in particular. And they, of course, have been able to do their own maths on this budget. They recognise that in many cases for them, particularly if they're lower middle income earners, their cuts will be modest, comparative, of course, to some of those higher income earners. And a lot of those cuts will almost be immediately swallowed up, not just by the fact that New Zealand will have one of the highest consumption taxes in the OECD via the increase in GST to 15%, but people, of course, are very live to that, but also the fear of what an increase in inflation to 5.9% will mean for the many, many homeowners in particular who have disproportionately high and large mortgages in Auckland in particular. And those members on that side of the House who are from Auckland will know that in that area households tend to spend a greater proportion of their income, well above the national average, on rent or on home ownership. And that means that inflation is a real fear factor for those people. The true measure of this budget is whether or not people will feel better off, and on that measure it will fail. I do want to delve into the housing issue a little more deeply. It's been brushed over by government members as something that somehow they have dealt with through the simple measures that we see in this budget, but I don't believe that is the case. What will this budget do for, first of all, wannabe first home buyers and the plentiful renters that we have in my city in particular? The government decided to target the measure of depreciation, but I don't believe from what I've seen that will in any way compel those housing investors who are holding on to our housing stock to sell up, but rather to recoup the additional loss that they anticipate, and that, of course, will have a harmful effect on the many renters in my electorate. For instance, a survey of landlords was taken. the electorate I represent, Labour, it's known as Auckland Central. A survey of landlords found that 50% of landlords plan to increase rents, and that will have an incredible impact on those low and modest income earners who will get maybe $15 from their tax cut, but are facing an increase in rent of between, I've heard cases of between $10 and $30 per week. Aaron Gilmore earlier in the evening talked about a student that had come into his office and who he jubilantly was able to sit down and show that this student was going to be, I believe, $2.62 or thereabouts better off as a consequence of the budget. What he didn't mention was the fact that that student, as a rentor, that student is someone who is paying a landlord for his room, may in fact face a similar increase when this budget, the full effects of this budget kicks in. He also didn't mention the fact that students are facing a $50 surcharge on these student loans, which in many ways is interest on student loans by stealth. Now that not only wipes out his $2.62, it puts him in the negative. And what about those who are aspiring to own their own home? This doesn't fix the ongoing supply issue, which we already know about. In fact, all it does is affect their ability to save if they are already a renter in the rental market. And finally, on that last measure, it doesn't make their lives better. I do want to touch on young families as well, because that's an area where we're seeing already the very tangible examples of how this budget will affect them. Anyone who's visited an early childhood education centre, and on my side of the house I know that will be many of the Labour Party members. I'm not so sure how many national MPs have visited ECEs recently. But in Auckland Central, for instance, I visited a Samoan bilingual ECE on Richmond Road. Now, there's no rhetoric in what they shared. The numbers were pretty simple. They are facing a cut in their funding of $100,000 because of the pure fact that they aspired to have their centre full of qualified teachers to get better outcomes, because that's what evidence demonstrates happens when you have qualified teachers in ECEs. So because they followed the direction of the Labour government in ensuring that we had a higher ratio of qualified teachers in their centre, they are now being punished for that, as are many ECEs in Auckland, which tend to have a high proportion of qualified registered teachers teaching in their centres. So I would like to ask government members if they would care to speak on that point and perhaps share some tips with some of the people running those centres. For instance, is it their suggestion that they start charging individual parents per child what on average seems to be at the $20 to $30 cost per child to cover keeping them in these underfunded ECEs now? Or perhaps what should these ECEs do when they recognise that they also have families who were previously covered by WINS to have their child receive additional support, but the threshold is moved so they're facing a double hit? How is it that this is making their lives better? And it would be remiss of me not to mention young people. There's been much trumpeting about how this budget has initiatives that will assist the 60,000 young unemployed people in New Zealand. To date, the government response on youth unemployment has first and foremost been to deny the numbers and to talk about benefit numbers also, which is completely disingenuous given that a number of young people are unable to access and are not eligible for benefits, the measure that the government chooses to use. The second technique seems to be to try to reduce those who are able to access support from the government if they're unable to find work by denying access via forcing them onto the limited service volunteers program before allowing them to access the benefit. And the final attempt to assist these young people seems to be to deny them access to training, education and support. At worst, at best, it's a poor plan, and at worst, it's ignoring a significant issue. Again, this budget has done nothing for those young people. I was told just before the budget came out, in fact, I was asked by a national MP, who I won't name, whether or not I was looking forward to my tax cut. I told him no, and that I would rather that he did something useful with it, perhaps like continue to fund ECE. He then responded, but it will make you aspirational. I didn't respond to him at the time, but I have to say, having seen the budget in its entirety now, in some way perhaps it has made me aspirational. I have more aspiration